Hey, welcome back, and welcome to the next substantive part of the course. We're talking about time thieves, and I'm going to use these next lessons to explain a couple of related concepts that both have to do with the dangers of handoffs. Though actually, I've been calling them handoffs in previous lessons, but in the course of building this lesson and the next one, I've decided that the term transitions better encapsulates the concept I'm trying to explain. You'll see why later. I've also decided to break this lesson into two parts, so this part is going to be dealing with waiting periods. If you're following along from the last lesson, you'll know that we adjusted our policies on the Kanban board to allow for a WIP limit of 2 in the doing column. I'll continue to offer suggestions on how to improve your board while we also discuss some of the reasons why your work isn't flowing as smoothly through your systems as you might like. For source material, I'm going to come back to some concepts from this Domenica de Grandis book, specifically this part about dependencies, which I'm now calling transitions. And transitions include gaps in the sequence of events, which is what I'm talking about in this lesson, as well as handoffs to other resources for getting parts of your work done, which I'll hit on next. Now, transitions are a funny thing. They're kind of like inventory in our previous lesson. They're necessary in order to get things done, but the wrong kind of transitions, or too many of them, can cause unintended or unnecessary delay. For most of this lesson, however, I'm going to take source material from this book. This is Lean by Nicholas Modig and Par Ahlstrom. We're going to think through a couple of different ways to look at efficiency, and if you're like some people, you might realize that you've been looking at efficiency from a skewed perspective all along. To explain the difference between resource and flow efficiency, we'll start with a hypothetical. We're going to pretend that you have an estate planning practice, and this is your new client, Ms. Green. Ms. Green needs an estate plan, and she'd like it before she goes off to a nice beach vacation in a few weeks. So if you're like most estate planners I know, you'll send her an intake form of some sort, then probably have her come in for a meeting to discuss her wants and needs. You'll do a little research and assemble your initial draft, and then send it off to the client as homework for her to review. Once you get that homework back, you'll make some revisions and have the client come back to your office for a signing ceremony. And then I'm going to assume a simple plan, so at the end of the process, you'll have a few things you need to do to close out the file, but nothing too complicated. And yes, for you actual estate planners, I know this is an oversimplification. Now, let's take a look at the amount of time it takes to get through each part of the process. I'm going to call this length of time about a week, and we'll put a timeline on here for 1 week increments. Let's look at two different sets of time. The first is going to be your working time. We'll put that in blue. And the intake form won't take this long. Let's call it maybe a 0.5. After that, you'll need maybe 90 minutes on the intake meeting and somewhere between 4 hours researching and building the first draft. Again, these are hypothetical numbers. You probably won't have too much working time while the client's doing their homework, but you may need to check in, so let's call that another 0.5. And let's say maybe 2 hours making revisions and cleaning things up on the draft. Another hour for the signing ceremony, and let's say a 1.5 to wrap up everything and close out the file. I'll adjust the spacing a little to reflect when the work might actually get done. In between each of the working times, we have gaps, which we'll call waiting times, and we'll designate those in orange. Again, these graphics aren't quite to scale, but we'll call it good enough. If we add up all of the working time bars, we get a total working time of 10 hours. But when we add up the wait time, this orange bar already tells you it's looking a little long. If we're generous and we assume business hours at 40-hour weeks, then the total comes to 270 hours. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm waiting for something, I don't really think in terms of business hours. So really, we're looking at 1,166 total hours of waiting over this 7-week period. Let's go back to the overall timeline for a second. The good news from your perspective is that you can work on estate plans for more than one client over the course of those weeks. So if we add another client whose work is staggered, then you don't have outright waiting time, at least from your perspective. You start to fill in the gaps. Add more people with different timing, and you can fill up your working time pretty well. And this, of course, is how most law practices work, playing sort of a game of Tetris to make sure you're getting as much working time out of your week as possible. This is called resource efficiency. And the idea is to maximize the utilization of the resources in your business, in this case you. Notice I turned the worker blue since green was the client color. And to achieve high utilization, you need to piece together as many of these blocks of working time as possible. Now, if we look at aggregate working time versus aggregate wait time, we've got about 32 hours of working time versus just 8, again looking here at business hours, of waiting time. That comes to a utilization rate of 80%, which by traditional measures is actually pretty good. But if we're talking about client experience and client perceptions of value, which we definitely should be doing, then we need to also be looking at working and waiting time from Ms. Green's perspective. Through that lens, the client waits a total of 1,176 hours, the 7 full weeks, in order to take delivery on your 10 hours of work. From her perspective, you have a working efficiency of just 0.8%. Ms. Green is not amused. Remember, she wanted to get this wrapped up before vacation. So wait a minute. Everything we've just done is totally consistent with the conventional wisdom of running an efficient law practice. Yeah, it's a bummer for the client, but that's just how it goes, right? Turns out there is another kind of efficiency, and it's something your clients will love. Before I get to this better way, however, I have to hit a couple more background topics. First, let me kill a myth, or at least expose a trend. If your firm has a utilization rate of 80%, congratulations, but you would be a pretty extreme outlier. According to the 2018 Legal Trends Report from Clio, the typical attorney is only doing paid work about 12 hours a week. That's a 30% utilization rate. Not exactly the makings of a happy lawyer. One of the reasons for this inefficiency is that there's another type of time that's not quite working and not quite waiting. We'll call it tracking time, or we could call it switching time. I'll use both. We already touched on this concept a few lessons ago. Remember, we talked about the effort it takes to track the various balls you have in the air? It's work that's not really advancing any individual ball, but it's also something you can't skip because you might wind up dropping some balls if you do. That interstitial effort shows up in several places, some of them predictable and some of them not. The predictable parts come in the form of ramp up. Every time you sit down to do a particular chunk of work, it just takes a certain amount of time and effort to wrap your brain around the new task you're about to do. And these switching costs exist for every chunk of work that you do. The more chunks that you have, the more switching and tracking costs that you get. But it gets worse. There are two other ways they steal your time. Zooming in again on a tighter chunk of work, and I'm going to call this now a single day's worth of work. We know that we have some ramp-up time or switching cost every time we start this new task, but that assumes all of our work is planned and uninterrupted. Every time we get an interruption, it affects our flow of work. Then you need to have a new chunk of work to actually do the interrupting task, but you'll also need a new ramp-up period to re-engage with the thing you were just working on. And let's face it, there can be a lot of interruptions in our day. So now we've got this thing where we have our working time, both planned and unplanned, but we also have this waiting time or other time that we're not spending on client work. We've also got this new chunk of work we're calling transition time that's work that we have to do, but it isn't really adding value to us or for our client. It's even worse than that, though. You may have seen news articles around this UC Irvine study a few years back, where the researchers found that it took an average of just over 23 minutes to recover from an interruption and get back on task, and that people who experienced regular interruptions at work felt higher levels of stress, frustration, mental effort, and time pressure compared with those who worked in peace. What that means is that these transition times are going to be quite a bit longer than we might otherwise assume. And remember, this is time you can't recover. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't really seem appropriate to me to be billing it to clients either. Okay, so I promised a better way. Consider this my Ron Popeil infomercial switch. Going back to our assumptions about the estate planning workflow, this time, instead of designing our workflow around the utilization of resources, we're going to shine the spotlight on our customer experience and see what we can do to get her the thing she needs, in this case her estate plan, in the time frame that she really wants. The question is, how can we rearrange our workflow to accelerate our delivery of value to the client? I'm going to show the times here. both on the timeline but also as aggregate time so that we can keep track of it in two ways. And remember, we still have these transition chunks to deal with too. Now, we could try to reduce our working time, maybe use some document assembly software or other technology to try to speed things up. But in the overall scheme of things, working time isn't really our problem. It's the waiting time that's causing all the delay, especially from the client's point of view. So what if we prioritized our activities to reduce wait time? Well, first off, we may not need quite so much time between the intake form and the face-to-face meeting. So what if we move that meeting forward? Not bad. Keeping all of the things the same, eliminating some of that early wait time gets us down to a 6-week overall delivery time frame. But why wait until the next week to start drafting the estate plan? Heck, the client information is fresh in your head right after that in-person meeting. Why not schedule an extra long block of time so that you can jump right into drafting once that meeting is over? Now that's pretty good too. And besides, this way you can have your client get their homework that evening when they get back home, which means everything is fresh in her head too. Now, there's an added bonus if we stack 2 chunks of work back to back. We might be able to avoid this chunk of transition time too. Now, some chunks of work might need a certain amount of waiting time, like client homework, for instance. But you shouldn't give her any more time than she actually needs to do the homework, because she's just going to put things off until close to the deadline anyway. My point is that anywhere you can reduce or eliminate wait time can have a huge impact on the overall timeline of your delivery of legal work. This makes Ms. Green really happy because it means she gets to enjoy her vacation knowing that the adulting thing she hired you to do is all taken care of. And this is what we mean by flow efficiency. Instead of prioritizing the utilization of your resources, we're prioritizing the flow of work through your system. And there's actually a lot of benefits of flow efficiency, and happier clients is a big one, but also, maybe counterintuitively, you can actually get more matters closed in a particular time period by limiting the number of new matters you start, but focusing on getting those matters to flow more quickly through your process. I've used this slide a couple of times already, but it bears repeating. Limiting your WIP and then really focusing on getting things to done will improve the capacity of your entire system. Remember, we had multiple matters in flight at the same time over this 7-week time period in the original example. But by consolidating working periods into slightly longer chunks, therefore eliminating transition times, and also compressing the overall time frame to reduce or eliminate waiting times, we can actually improve the capacity of this team to finish more estate plans in the same time period. That's because instead of working on all these matters at the same time, by the time you're starting on the matter for this 4th client, you have already closed out work for the first one. So you're actually having fewer matters on your plate at any given moment. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for now. No change to the Kanban board. Like I said, we'll be at this for a while. Coming up, I'm going to actually hit on the handoffs topic I teased before. And then we'll get to the waiting column on your board. See you soon.